The fire hadn't cared that Luce had nothing left to feed it. She'd burned the last of the birch bark an hour ago, maybe 2, and the small flame she'd nursed in the hollow of the deadfall had guttered out while she wasn't watching. That was the thing nobody told you about hypothermia. It didn't announce itself. It just sat down beside you, like an old friend, and started talking in a very reasonable voice about how tired you were, how the ground wasn't so cold after all, how closing your eyes for a moment wouldn't hurt anything. Luce had been listening to that voice for a while now. She'd lost the trail sometime yesterday afternoon when the creek crossing washed out her map. She'd been walking the Canadian Rockies for 2 days. On nothing but a quarter tin of sardines, and the dogged conviction that the logging road had to be somewhere north of the ridge. It wasn't, or if it was, she hadn't found it. The October storm that rolled off the mountains that morning had buried her tracks and her confidence in roughly equal measure. She pressed her back against the trunk of a Engelmann spruce and tried to count her fingers. She could see 4 on her left hand. She thought there were 5, but she couldn't feel them well enough to be certain. The sound came from upslope. It wasn't wind. Wind moved sideways. This came in a rhythm, a deep, deliberate hiss and thud that she felt in the frozen ground before she heard it clearly. She forced her eyes open wider. A shape emerged from the grey curtain of snowfall. It was massive, a broad-shouldered silhouette, hauling something long and flat behind it. A toboggan. The man pulling it was enormous, moving with the unhurried efficiency of something that had no reason to hurry, because nothing in this wilderness had ever given him cause to. He wore a heavy canvas coat the color of tree bark, and his beard was thick, dark, and frosted at the edges. He stopped 8 feet away. He didn't shout. He didn't rush toward her. He stood there in the falling snow and looked at her the way a person looks at a problem they were not expecting to find on their route home. "You're off the trail," he said. His voice was a low, unhurried thing, rough as creek gravel. Luce tried to say something smart. What came out was a clicking sound from her back teeth rattling together. He set down the 2 hickory poles he'd been using to push the toboggan through the crust and walked toward her. She registered the size of him more clearly as he closed the distance. Tall, wide across the chest and shoulders, moving with a careful deliberateness that large men sometimes had, as if they'd learned early that the world bruised easier than they did. He crouched in front of her. His eyes were a pale, flat grey. They were taking inventory. He wasn't afraid of what he found. He reached out, took her hand, and pressed 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist. He held it for 5 seconds. His expression didn't change. "How long?" he asked. She didn't know what he was asking. How long since she'd eaten? Since she'd had water? Since she'd been warm? 2 days, she said. It covered all of it. He let go of her wrist and stood. He looked back at the toboggan, then at her, then at the sky. She watched him calculate. "Can you stand?" She tried. Her legs buckled before she'd fully straightened, and she would have gone face first into the snow if his hand hadn't closed around her forearm. He held her there, upright, neither pulling nor pushing, just steady. "That's a no," not unkindly. He walked her to the toboggan. It was piled deep, rolled canvas, 2 heavy fur bundles, a wooden crate lashed with rope. There was no clear space. She stared at it. "There's no room," she managed. "There will be." He reached across and shifted the canvas bundle to one side, creating a narrow depression in the load. He looked at her. "Sit." She grabbed the rope lashing and tried to lever herself onto the pile. Her arms had nothing left in them. She slid back down. "I can't." "I know." He stepped behind her. His hands went to her waist, and he lifted her. Not with effort, just lifted her, the way you'd lift a pack onto a shelf, and set her sideways on the load. She started to slide immediately. The fur was slick with ice crystals, and the toboggan was canted on a slope, and her frozen fingers couldn't grip anything. "It's 2, I'm going to fall off," she gasped. "You're not." He said it with the certainty of someone who had already decided how the next few minutes would go. He stepped up behind her onto the back runners of the toboggan, and before she could ask what he was doing, he sat down, pulling her back against him in one smooth motion. She landed against a wall of solid warmth. She'd thought she was sitting on the fur bundle. She was not sitting on the fur bundle. His legs were on either side of her, his left arm coming around her waist like a closing gate, and his chest, broad and startlingly warm through the canvas, was at her back. "Oh," she said. "Hold still," he said, already reaching for the poles. The toboggan began to move. It shouldn't have worked. She was sideways, and there was no good place to put her legs, and she was essentially a bag of wet grain wedged against a stranger's chest, while he pulled them through 6 inches of fresh snow on a 45-degree slope in a whiteout. It absolutely should not have worked. But he was warm. He was the warmest thing she had ever encountered in her life. Heat came off him in steady, dense waves, through the canvas of his coat, through the wool beneath, straight into her frozen back. She felt it move through her like the first sip of something hot, tentative, and then spreading. She hated how much she needed it. "Where are we going?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Cabin." He shifted his weight to steer around a fallen log. The movement pressed her harder into his side. His arm tightened fractionally, not possessively, just mechanically, holding her in place the way you'd brace cargo on a downhill run. How far? 20 minutes. She looked out at the grey nothing of the storm. 20 minutes felt like geography, and geography felt theoretical. She concentrated on breathing. "You're crushing my ribs," she said, because the pressure of his arm was real, and she needed to say something that wasn't "thank you." Better than the alternative. He didn't loosen his grip. Wind picks up on the open stretch. You'd roll right off. She didn't argue. Cynicism had been her armor for 29 years, and it was still in place, just damp. She pulled her knees up and leaned back into his chest and felt the slow, steady thump of his heartbeat against her shoulder blade. It was unreasonably calm. They rode in silence. The storm pressed down around them. The toboggan hissed through the crust. She counted his heartbeats because it was something to count, something regular and reliable in a morning that had had neither quality. The cabin appeared in a gap between 2 stands of lodgepole pine. It wasn't pretty. It was low and solid and dark, the logs chinked with what looked like clay and moss, the roof steep and heavily loaded with snow. A stovepipe emerged from one end, and a lean-to on the south side sheltered a cord and a half of split wood, stacked to the eaves. It looked like it had been built by someone who understood that the mountain didn't care about aesthetics. He stopped the toboggan at the door. He stepped off first, then lifted her down. Again that unceremonious efficiency, hands at her waist, feet on the ground, and caught her when her legs went out. He walked her inside, with one hand on her arm, kicked the door shut behind them. The cabin was dark and smelled of pine pitch and dry wood, and the faint mineral tang of cold stone. He let go of her arm and she stood swaying while he moved across the room. A match scraped, a lamp caught, light fell across a low room, one long table, 2 chairs, a wooden bunk against the back wall, a cast iron stove in the center, and a massive stone hearth occupying most of the north wall. He crouched at the hearth. She watched him build the fire. He didn't waste a single motion. Kindling laid in a careful crosshatch, a coal from the banked center, one breath timed precisely. Flame took hold within 40 seconds. He stood and looked at her. "Sit." She dropped into the nearest chair. Her legs shook with relief. Boots off. She looked at her feet. The leather of her walking boots had stiffened into something close to iron. Her laces were frozen solid. "I can't, my hands." She held them up. The fingers were white from the second knuckle down, bluish at the tips. He pulled the other chair in front of her and sat. He looked at her boots for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket and drew out a folding knife. He opened it on his knee. She flinched before she could stop herself, a fast, involuntary pull backward that she hated herself for immediately. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He turned the knife so the spine faced up, showing her the tool and not the edge. "Laces are gone," he said simply. "I'm cutting them." He sliced through the frozen cord in 2 passes, grabbed the heel and toe of her left boot, and pulled. The sound she made was not dignified. The pain was a white flash that traveled from her foot straight to the back of her skull. She gripped the arm of the chair and held on, while he peeled the wool sock away, revealing a foot the color of old candle wax, with a bruised purple creeping up from the heel. He looked at it, without any visible alarm, which she found perversely reassuring. He reached for a tin pail sitting near the door, went outside briefly. She heard snow being packed into it, and came back. He set the pail on the floor. Then he put both hands into the snow, scooped up a dense handful, and pressed it directly onto her bare foot. She came half out of the chair. "Stop, God, stop, you're making it worse." "I'm making it not amputated." He said it calmly, and began to rub. "Hot water bursts the vessels, you thaw slow, it's going to hurt." It did. It hurt with a thoroughness that she hadn't thought possible. She bit down on the sleeve of her coat and breathed through her nose and tried to think about something else and failed. Tears ran down her face without permission. He ignored them. He worked with the focus of someone running through a checklist. When the snow in his hands melted, he reached for more. When she shifted away from the pain, his grip tightened. He wasn't gentle. He wasn't unkind. He was entirely concentrated on what the foot needed, and the foot needed friction and cold and time, and so that was what it received. "Name's Birch," he said, 10 minutes in. She blinked at him through wet lashes. He hadn't looked up from her foot. "What?" "If you're going to cry in my cabin, you should know what to call me." She let out something between a laugh and a sob. "Luce," she managed. He repeated it once, flat, the way you record a fact. He set her left foot down on a rolled canvas near the fire and picked up his knife again. "Brace yourself, Luce," he said. "We get to do the other one." She pressed her face into her sleeve. For the next quarter hour the cabin held only the fire's voice, and Luce's muffled light sounds, and Birch's slow, even breathing. He didn't soothe her. He didn't apologize for the pain. He did the work. All of it, methodically and without complaint, until both feet were elevated on the canvas near the hearth, throbbing with an agonized red heat that meant, he told her, that she would keep them. He stood, wiped his hands on his thighs, walked to the stove and lifted the lid of a small iron pot that had been sitting on the back burner. He poured something dark into a tin cup and brought it to her. "Drink." She reached for it. Her hands shook badly enough that she sloshed it over the rim. He watched this for a moment, then sat down beside her on the bench he'd pulled close to the fire, reached an arm around her back, and held the cup to her mouth himself. "Spruce tip tea and something else," he said. "It'll taste like the floor of the forest. Drink it anyway." It tasted like pine and cheap rye whiskey, and it burned straight down to her stomach. She leaned her head back against his shoulder without deciding to. His arm around her was steady and warm, and entirely lacking in the quality she had learned to look for in a man's touch. That waiting quality. That slight forward lean of wanting something. He wasn't leaning, he was just there. "Why did you come up here alone?" he asked. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the fire. "Supply truck driver from the forestry camp said the Elk Creek Trail was passable." He was wrong. Obviously. Silence. "Why are you up here alone?" she asked. He took the cup back, drank from it himself, looked at the flames. A long pause. "Prefer it," he said. It wasn't a full answer. She understood that it was all the answer she was going to get tonight. She filed it away. He gave her the bunk. He rolled out a canvas bedroll near the hearth, without discussion or offer, simply establishing the fact of where they would each sleep, as if it were a matter of logistics and not courtesy. She supposed to him it probably was both. She lay on the narrow bunk and listened to the storm claw at the roof, and thought, he hasn't tried anything. He could have. He was 3 times her size, and she couldn't have walked to the door. He hadn't. He had made tea and taken her boots off and given her his bed. She didn't know what to do with that. She slept without a knife under her pillow for the first time in 4 years. A week passed. The storm didn't relent so much as it recalibrated, cycling between hard driving snow and the kind of still pale cold that pressed down on the cabin like a weight. The world outside reduced itself to the woodpile and the lean-to and the dark shape of the tree line, and inside it was birch and Luce and 16 feet of rough-hewn floor between them. She learned his routines. He was up before light every morning, silent, building the fire back before she woke. He went out to check the trap line in the morning, returned by midday. He cooked in the evening, plain, careful food, nothing wasted. He read in the evenings by the lamp, thick books with cracked spines, and he turned the pages slowly, and he never told her what they were about. She tried to be useful. On the 4th day, she attempted to split kindling in the lean-to, while he was out on the line, and she missed the round and put the hatchet into her thumb instead of the wood. It was shallow, more shocking than serious, but she bled through half a rag before she got it under control, and she'd made a mess of the lean-to floor. He came back to find her sitting on the woodpile with her hand wrapped and her jaw set. She braced herself for it, the same tightness she always felt, shoulders up, breath shallow, waiting for the noise and the heat of someone else's anger to wash over her. She'd learned young that spilled things and broken things cost more than they were worth, and the cost was always paid the same way. Birch looked at the blood on the floor. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. His expression didn't change. He walked past her to the woodpile, picked up 3 rounds she'd split before the accident, and carried them inside. She heard him set them down by the hearth. He came back out, picked up 3 more, went inside. On the 3rd trip, he stopped beside her. "Let me see it." She unwrapped it. He tilted her thumb toward the grey daylight, examining the cut with the same flat professional interest he'd applied to her frost-bitten feet. He went inside and came back with a small tin and a strip of clean linen. He sat beside her on the woodpile and dressed the wound. His hands were careful. They were always careful. She'd noticed that. Careful in a way that suggested it was a choice he made deliberately, not something that came naturally to a man that size. "I should have been paying attention," she said, defensive. "The hatchet's too heavy for what you were trying to do," he said. "I've got a smaller one inside. I'll show you tomorrow." That was it. That was all of it. She sat beside him in the cold and thought, he's not even going to make me feel bad about it. And somehow that was harder to absorb than if he had been angry. The snow kept falling. On the 11th day, the temperature dropped sharply in the afternoon. Birch spent the morning hauling extra wood inside, checking the stovepipe joints, reinforcing the shutter latches on the single window. He worked quickly and without explanation. Luce watched the sky through the glass. It had gone the color of a bruise, greenish-yellow at the horizon. "Bad?" she asked. "Rocky Mountain convergence zone. Wind comes off the front and the back range at the same time." "Yes." He tested the window latch with both hands. "If the shutter holds, we're fine." "And if it doesn't?" "It'll hold." It didn't hold. At 4 in the afternoon, the gust hit the cabin like a truck. The structure groaned all at once, every log and joint. A crack, loud as a rifle shot, and the iron latch on the window shutter snapped clean. The shutter blew inward. Snow and freezing air exploded through the gap, extinguishing the lamp and scattering a shower of sparks from the hearth. The cold was absolute. Luce was on her feet before she knew she was moving, but the sudden darkness and the blast of air and the crack of the wood hit something old and deep inside her, and her body stopped following instructions. She pressed herself against the log wall, arms over her head, breath gone. She wasn't in the cabin. She was in a kitchen in Lethbridge 4 years ago, with her hands braced on the counter and the door coming in off its hinges the same way, hard and loud and wrong. Luce, his voice cut through, not loud, just present. A hand caught her wrist, not grabbing, just contact, real and solid. Luce, I need you to hear me. He crouched in front of her. She could feel the heat of him through the roar of the wind. Shutters off one hinge. I can hold it, but I need another set of hands. You with me? She breathed once. Yes, she said. Hammers on the table, 3 nails in the tin beside it. Bring them. She went to the table on her hands and knees, feeling across the surface in the dark until her fingers found the hammer handle. She swept the tin into her other hand. She crawled to where he was braced against the shutter, his massive shoulders pressing the wood back against the force, trying to take it. Top corner, he said, his voice level, as if they were discussing the weather and not fighting it. Drive it deep. She positioned herself beside him, took a nail from the tin, and swung. She missed. The hammer glanced off the frame. Again, he said, no reprimand, just direction. She steadied her wrist against the wood to kill the trembling. Swung. The nail bit. She hit it again. 3 more strikes, and it was flush. She moved to the bottom corner without being told, positioned, swung. This one she hit first try. Steel on iron, the sharp bright ring of it cutting through the wind's howl. She drove it home. Birch secured the remaining corners himself, 2 blows per nail, and stepped back. The shutter held. The storm screamed at it, found no purchase, moved on. He looked down at her. She was sitting on the floor, the hammer still in her hand, her chest working hard. She expected him to say something about how she'd frozen at the start, how she'd been useless for the first 30 seconds. He reached down and took the hammer from her. Set it on the table. Strong swing, he said quietly. He turned to the hearth and began rebuilding the fire. Luce sat on the floor and felt something shift in her chest, something old and clenched. It didn't open, not yet, not all the way, but it moved. The storm lasted 2 more days. By the end of it, the cold had driven them close to the hearth in the evenings, not out of agreement, but out of physics. He spread his heavy canvas coat on the floor near the fire. He sat on it. He didn't say anything. He looked at the empty space beside him. She sat down. He didn't put an arm around her. He shifted his weight so his thigh pressed the length of hers, his shoulder settled against hers, and they faced the fire together without commentary. The heat transferred between them, slow, steady, certain. She felt the set of his body beside her. She felt him not leaning forward. It was the safest she had ever been next to another person. She didn't know what to do with that either. On the 15th evening, the storm was over, and the world outside was quiet, and Birch was sitting at the table with a piece of moose hide spread in front of him, working through it with a curved awl and a thick needle threaded with sinew. She was mending a tear in his spare wool shirt, an arrangement they hadn't discussed. She watched his hands. They were scarred at the knuckles, calloused in the specific places that came from years with ropes and tools. She'd expected hands that size to be clumsy. They weren't. The needle moved through the hide with a precision that came from a long time spent practicing, until the hands knew what to do without being supervised. "What are you making?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Boots." She set the shirt down. "For who?" He pulled the sinew through and made a sound that might have been confirmation. "Your walking boots are finished. I took them apart to see what was salvageable." He glanced over at her feet, wrapped in a pair of his wool socks that puddled around her ankles. Your arch is high. I'll account for it. She looked at her sock-covered feet. She looked at him. You don't have to do that. Winter's not done. He tied off a stitch and reached for the awl again. If you go outside in those, you'll lose those toes. I spent an hour thawing out. He set the awl down and turned in his chair. Come here. I need to measure. She walked to the table. She stood in front of him. Seated, he was still nearly level with her collarbone. Foot up, he said, tapping his thigh. The memory of the toboggan went through her, quick and sharp, the heat of him, the arm across her waist. She put her foot on his thigh. He took it in both hands. This was different from the first night, methodical and slow, no urgency in it. He pressed his thumb along the ball of her foot, measuring width. He ran a finger down the arch. His calluses caught slightly on the wool. The friction sent a sensation up her leg that she wasn't expecting. And she tightened her grip on the edge of the table. He wrapped his fingers around her ankle to gauge circumference. He stopped. He didn't look up. But his hands went still, and in the quiet, she became acutely aware that two of his fingers were resting directly on her pulse point, and her pulse was doing nothing to help her appear calm. He held it there for a moment, just a moment. He dragged his thumb slowly across the knob of her ankle bone. It was not a measurement. It was unhurried and deliberate, and she felt it in places that had nothing to do with her ankle. He looked up. His pale eyes met hers and held them, and the flat professional distance in them was gone, replaced by something careful and heavy and aware. You made it through the worst of it, he said, his voice lower than usual. His hands slid down, smoothed across the top of her foot, and released her. Let's see how you are when the cold breaks. He turned back to the hide. She walked back to the bunk on legs that weren't entirely reliable. He finished the boots in late January. He set them on the floor beside the bunk without ceremony. A clunk of solid leather on the planks, and went to check the stove. She looked at them. They were plain and dark, and built like small fortresses. The leather was supple and sealed, with something that smelled of rendered fat and beeswax. The stitching was tight, and even as print. She turned one over. He'd carved crosshatches into the sole for grip on ice. She put them on. They fit the way good things fit, not perfectly, which would have been suspicious, but correctly. The shanks supported her arch the way he'd said it would, firm and precise. She stood up. She put her weight on her heels. No pain. She looked at him. He was standing with his back to her, watching the snow through the window. They fit, she said. Good. The snowpack on the roof is 2 feet heavy. We have to clear it before it caves. He set his mug down. Get your coat. The domestic warmth of the cabin did not survive contact with the mountain. The mountain simply continued doing what it had always done, indifferent to whatever was shifting between two people in a 16 by 20 space. They spent the day on the roof, Luce digging from the ground level, while Birch worked above with a long-handled wooden blade. She'd been soft from weeks inside, and the first hour punished her for it. But then something settled into her muscles, a rhythm, a heat that was hers and not borrowed from anyone else, and she kept going. She was resting on her shovel when she heard the crack. It was different from the sound of ice under pressure. It was a release, sudden and wrong, and then Birch's boots left the roof, and he hit the slope and slid toward the edge, with the speed and inevitability of something that had already decided. Birch. He went over. His right hand shot out and caught the timber overhang. His whole weight snapped against it. The wood groaned. He hung there, 12 feet above the frozen ground, one arm holding everything. Luce dropped her shovel and was already moving. Birch, let go. I'll move the firewood. She was pulling at the stacked rounds beneath him, clearing the landing, hands tearing at the frozen wood. Stop. His voice came out tight and compressed, all the air in it used up. Move back. You can't. Move back. She moved back. He set his jaw. She could see the tendons in his neck from 12 feet below. She could see the precise moment when he chose what was going to happen next. His left hand found purchase beside his right, his shoulders loaded, and then, with a sound that was half effort and half something more animal than that, he hauled himself. All of himself, everything he weighed, up and over the edge of the roof. He lay on his back on the flat section near the eaves, chest heaving, staring up at the white Alberta sky. Luce stood below him, with both hands pressed over her mouth, and her knees shaking badly enough that she could hear her boots knocking against each other. He rolled over and looked down at her over the edge. His face was flushed. The calm was still there, somewhere, but it was working harder than usual. He looked at her hands, pressed over her mouth. He looked at her eyes. "I hate finding dead things on the trap line," he said, his breathing rough. "Figured you might feel the same." The sound she made was not a laugh. It was not a sob. It was somewhere between, the kind of sound that happens when a body doesn't know which it needs more. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and turned away. "Go inside," he called quietly. "Get the stove up, I'm coming down." February went. March came in with dripping eaves and the particular quality of light that happened when the sun found a new angle and meant it. Luce woke to it one morning and lay still on the bunk and listened to the water running from the roof and felt a cold spike drive itself into her stomach. The pass would open. She lay there and calculated the distance from here to the road, and the road to the nearest town, and what would be waiting in that town. Nothing was the honest answer. No posting. No family worth returning to. The city she'd left had a person in it she was not prepared to encounter again. A person who'd broken her door and her confidence in roughly the same motion, who'd stood over her and told her she was the kind of woman who did not get to leave. She had left anyway. She had been leaving, slowly, for 2 years, ending up here. Here. She turned her head and looked at Birch's bedroll on the floor. Empty. He was already up. She could smell coffee. She sat up. He was at the stove, his back to her, working the cast-iron pan with a fork. "The creek'll be down in 10 days, he said without turning. "Truck track off the East Ridge will be open by the end of the month." He was giving her a schedule. He was telling her when she could leave. She'd known it was coming. She'd known it since January, since the boots, since the moment on the roof when she'd felt something in her chest come unwired from something it had been bolted to for a long time. She'd known it, and she'd refused to think about it directly, the way you refuse to look at a thing that's going to hurt. She swung her legs off the bunk and reached for the boots. "I'll need to sort myself out," she said, which was almost comically untrue. She had a coat and the clothes she'd been found in, and his socks and the boots he'd made her. He set the fork down. The small sound of it on the stove edge was very loud in the cabin. He turned slowly. He looked at her. He looked at her in a way he hadn't before, or hadn't let her see before, fully. The way you look at something when you're done, pretending you're not looking at it. "Where are you going?" he said. "Town." She stood up. Her chin came up automatically, the defensive set she'd worn so long it lived in her bones. "I can find work. I can teach or take in laundry, or I'll manage. I always have." "Manage," he repeated. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back. "That's what I've been doing," she said, her voice going unsteady. "Managing. I managed on the trail, and I managed in this cabin, and when the thaw comes, I'll manage down there. That's how it works. People don't keep things past their usefulness." She hit him with her open palm, a flat strike to the center of his chest. "I know the rules. You helped me, and now the winter's done, and I'll go." She hit him again. He didn't move. "That's how it always works," she said, and her voice was shaking now, and she couldn't stop it. "So don't make this into something else." He let her hit him. He absorbed it the way the mountain absorbed everything, without rearranging itself. When her shoulder dropped and the breath went out of her in a rough, ragged push, he moved, not back, forward. He brought both hands up to her shoulders, heavy and warm and not squeezing, just resting, just present. "Are you done?" he said. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Yes." "Good." He shifted his hands to her jaw, slow enough that she could have stepped back, could have turned away. He tilted her face up. His thumbs rested against her cheekbones, rough and careful at once. She opened her eyes. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at everything in this wilderness that mattered, with complete, unhurried attention, not measuring, just seeing. "I've been alone up here for 6 years, he said. His voice had dropped to something rough and low. "I chose it. Every spring I could have gone down, and every spring I didn't." He paused. His thumb moved slightly across her cheek, barely a touch. This winter was the first time that felt like a mistake. He didn't push the moment further. He released her, stepped back, and went to pull the pan off the heat. "Eat something," he said. "There's wood to bring in." She stood in the center of the cabin and listened to the water, dripping from the eaves, and thought, "That's not dripping. That's the mountain deciding something." The east track opened on the 28th of March. She knew because Birch came in from the lean-to, with his coat still on, and said the horse was saddled. Luce was at the table. Her hands were folded in front of her. She'd been sitting there for 20 minutes already, waiting for this. She looked at him. He stood in the doorway. His face was carved stone. He was bracing himself, she saw, the set of his jaw, the stillness in him that was different from his ordinary stillness. He was waiting for her to walk through the door. She stood up. She walked toward him, and she didn't stop at a social distance. She walked all the way up until she was standing toe to boot with him, and she put her hands flat on his chest, over the canvas and the wool and the slow, steady thump beneath all of it. She felt him stop breathing. "The last time I trusted someone," she said quietly, "I spent 6 months trying to figure out how I'd been so stupid. I thought I'd burned the part of me that does that." She looked up at him. "I haven't." Something moved in his face, the brace of it shifting. "I'm not going down," she said, "not because I have nowhere to go. I have nowhere to go." She pressed her palms flat against his chest, feeling the warmth of him through all that canvas. "I'm staying because I want to. That's different. That's new for me, so I need you to know I know the difference." He looked at her for a long moment. Then both his arms came around her, and he pulled her in, and lifted her off the ground the same way he'd lifted her onto the toboggan in the storm. Not gently, but surely, completely. And he held on with the quiet, desperate grip of someone who has been waiting a long time to stop letting go of things. She held onto him back. She buried her face in the crook of his neck, and breathed in cold air and pine, and the particular smell that was just him. "You stay," he said against her hair. His voice was rough in a different way now. "You stay, and we figure out the rest as it comes." "Yes," she said. He set her down. He looked at her face. Then he kissed her, and it wasn't soft. It was the way he did everything, deliberate and complete, with his hand in her hair and his whole attention on it. And it tasted like coffee and the particular warmth of something decided. Outside, the melt water ran in thin, clear streams down the rock face and soaked into the dark soil. The lodge poles dripped. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slope, revealing last autumn's grass, matted and gold and still there. The winter was over. They had the rest of it to figure out.